I'm Reena Agarwal, Vice Provost for Faculty at Georgetown University and Director of the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy. Welcome to the Georgetown Global Virtual Fintech Seminar Series. First of all, I really hope you and your loved ones, everybody is safe and healthy during these very difficult times. Our thoughts and prayers are certainly with those that are at the front lines helping others. So the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy, we provide thought leadership for global finance. We believe in excellence in research to impact practice and policy. Last week, the center hosted an event with 5 former chief economists of the SEC and a former SEC commissioner examining the workings of the financial markets in the current environment. This recording is available on our website. Please feel free to check it out. Other events coming up are also available on our website, and our Twitter handle is @GUFinPolicy. We at Georgetown, just like other universities, have been busy helping faculty with instructional continuity, and research continuity is just as important. In that spirit, the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy quickly started a virtual seminar series. I'm most grateful to our team, Alberto Rossi, Associate Director of the Center, and Anna Kormas, Assistant Director of the Center. I'm also grateful to all our partners and sponsors. I particularly want to point out Georgetown is part of Ripple's what's called UBRI, University Blockchain Research Initiative. This is a collaboration with leading universities around the world to support and accelerate academic research, technical development, and innovation in blockchain, cryptocurrency, and digital payments. So this series is partly made available because of a grant from UBRI. Last week, our speaker was Professor Manju Puri. Today, I am absolutely delighted to have Maureen O'Hara as our speaker. Other confirmed speakers include Luigi Zingales, David Yermak, Amit Siru, Antoinette Shore, Ghosh John. I do want to point out next week we won't have a seminar. April 10th, it's Good Friday, and Georgetown is closed. So we are absolutely delighted to have Professor Maureen O'Hara as our presenter today. Professor O'Hara is the Robert Purcell Professor of Finance at Cornell University and also holds a professorship at the University of Technology, Sydney. And the professors in the audience, pretty much we all know Maureen for the amazing work she has done in so many different areas of finance and also fintech. Before I turn it over to Maureen, I just want to point out a couple of logistics here. So this is a one-hour seminar. We will keep about 20 minutes for Q&A. Please use the Zoom chat feature to send your questions, and Professor Alberto Rossi will coordinate these questions. We'll also try to use the raise your hand feature in Zoom to address questions. And I'd appreciate if you can keep yourself muted during the event. Thank you for joining us, and I am going to hand this over to Maureen for her presentation. Thank you, Maureen.
Well, thank you, Reena, very much. Let me make sure here that we've got everything set up here from beginning. Come on now, there we go. So I think we're all set here. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this seminar series. I'm very impressed you all were so quick to set it up, and I know that all of the people joining are pleased to have the opportunity to meet virtually like this. So thank you, Alberto and Reena. I also want to echo what Reena said. I hope that everyone out there is doing well. Obviously, very difficult times. And I hope that at least for this hour, it'll make sheltering at home at least a little more interesting. So that's the hope. Let me note that those of you who were at the seminar last week saw what I thought was just an excellent seminar by Manju Puri. It was very polished, very interesting paper. My hopes for today are also that it'll be an interesting paper, but I'll stress that this paper is a little bit earlier in its development. So, you know, it's something we've been working on, and we're really delighted to have a chance to share. Let me note that this is a joint work with Soumya Basu, David Easley, and Gun Sirer. Soumya and Gun are both in the computer science department at Cornell, and Gun is also very much involved now with a very exciting startup company called Ava Labs. So I think they're actually both on the call. And David, of course, is in economics at Cornell. So we have a whole Cornell contingent here today. So let me talk a little bit about sort of where we're going with this. And so we're going to start with crypto from 10,000 feet. So a fundamental problem for all blockchains is how are you going to allocate space on the blockchain to competing needs? So I know everybody on this call is pretty much familiar with how the blockchain works, but the reality is the challenge is you have all these transactions and everybody wants theirs put on the blockchain. But it isn't as simple as saying just put it on the blockchain. And as we know, miners have to select the transactions to put on the blockchain. And so the way most cryptocurrencies do it is they rely on user-appended transaction fees to ration slots on the block. But this doesn't always work well. So for example, these are what transactions fees look like. You know, for the most part, it looks pretty quiet, but it's only because you had that very, very challenging time there in December 2017, when we know there was a huge boom in the blockchain. But actually, fee instability is a fairly common problem. If you look back, for example, to June of 2018, transactions fees that day ranged from 58 cents to $6.85. So the fee that users append to their transactions varies all over the place. And there isn't a set fee. It's up to each user to decide what they're going to attach to their transaction and hope that they've picked an amount that will induce a miner to include their transaction. So it's a little tricky to figure out what to do. And you see these sorts of complaints all the time, right? Why is my Bitcoin transaction taking so long? 2 weeks have passed, still nothing. Obviously, if you want to use a cryptocurrency as a transactional type of currency, you can't wait 2 weeks to find out if, in fact, the transaction is going to make it onto the blockchain. So the challenge is a real one. And it's one that arises basically because of the way that it was structured. If you think about blockchain, it's a brilliant system set up, but not necessarily set up to recognize the fact that when things work in markets, you kind of have to really pay attention to the fine details. And this is what Bitcoin fees look like more recently. You end up with this sawtooth pattern where they go up and then people get discouraged and then they stop and then they go back up and down and up and down. This sawtooth pattern is quite common. So what are the problems with fees? Well, they're fairly simple. It's difficult to choose the right fee. And some of you know there are services out there that try and predict the fees, but they actually tend to exacerbate the problem because they've got everybody then ratcheting up. And this is a real problem. And if you think about the underlying economic issue, underpayment leads to poor user experience. You wait forever, potentially, it seems. So at some point, users basically say, forget crypto, let's just use PayPal, right? I just wanted to buy something. And overpayment means it is very expensive and more expensive than it should be to use this cryptocurrency. And you might think simple heuristics would work, but they don't. They, as I mentioned, lead to rationing behavior and they exacerbate overpayment. So the problem we're working on is there a better fee structure? And one of the things that kind of inspired us to think about issues along this line is to think about lessons from sponsored search. So this is a little graph showing the fees in online search auctions. So if you know how these search engines work, this is actually from a very early search auction mechanism called Overture. So the way those search engines work, they pay for themselves, they make profits by auctioning off spots on the page when you search, right? The higher on the page, the more that someone's willing to pay for it. And so they run these little auctions all day long. But this is what Overture found, that they were running these auctions and the prices just kept ratcheting up and then collapsing and ratcheting up and just collapsing. And so this wasn't working very well. Now, you know, when we think about these problems, as an economist, we begin to recognize, well, wait a minute, we kind of know what's going on here to an extent, because if you get to attach a fee, and in general, you would think that the miners are picking the transactions with the highest fees to include on the blockchain, then what you have is a first price auction, right? You pay what you bid. And we know from auction theory that equilibria and first price auctions are efficient. And so theoretically, you can show all these wonderful properties under all kinds of conditions, I might add. But it's actually hard to achieve all of that efficiency and optimality, if you will, in practice, because the real world tends to be messier. And optimal bidding, even in, you know, the theoretical models, is complex, and it depends on the details of the auction environment. So as a result, sponsored search markets actually move to second price auctions. So if you look at Google, Google would say, well, you know, the reason we won is we had a better search engine. But it's also because they use something called GSP, which stands for Generalized Second Price Auction. So Google was, you know, sort of cognizant of this problem, and they changed to a framework that was adapted to their setting that uses a second price auction. Facebook uses a generalization of the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, the VCG mechanism that many of you are familiar with. So sponsored search is suggesting to us that, you know, this isn't a problem unique to crypto. Another way to think about it is the crypto needs to think about how can we draw from other areas. But as is always the case, it's not as simple as it seems, right? Because the cryptocurrencies have unique features that create, you know, some kind of fun wrinkles as we think about how can we design a better mechanism. One of them is that users are basically placing bids in an adversarial environment. If you think about how this works, right? Transactions occurred, they're all in the mempool. And you can't actually see what's in the mempools. You don't actually know what's out there. So you don't know the number of transactions that you're competing with. And one of the really interesting wrinkles here is that the miners aren't necessarily trusted auctioneers. Generally, when we look at auctions and on auction frameworks, you don't expect the auctioneer to be the problem. But here, the miners have all kinds of incentives to play games and manipulate the auctions. And sometimes I think we all say, well, you know, it's in the miners' best interest to make the cryptocurrency work. And it is. But it's also can be a secondary concern if the miners' own payments can be dramatically changed by strategic behavior. And for that matter, the users can behave strategically and do all kinds of stuff. So it's a very interesting framework for us to begin to think about how to do all this. So let's talk about what we decided to do. So Gun, Sumya, David, and I worked on this problem for a while, and it took us a while to come up with something that we actually thought worked. We had a lot of ideas that didn't. Some of you younger researchers out there, you know, it always looks easy, or at least it looks simple when somebody puts it out there, but I can assure you that we had lots of bad ideas up front, and hopefully this isn't one of them. But in any case, what we've come up with is a new sort of protocol that we think can work. It's a mechanism for charging for block space that provides stability, predictability, and a better experience for users and miners. It is inspired by second price auctions and VCG, but obviously it's going to be a little different because it's going to have to fit into our particular problem. And there's a bunch of features of this mechanism that I want to stress up front, that these are some of the things that we're going to show. One of the first things is, if you're thinking about what do you want a mechanism to do? Well, one thing you want is you want the high valued transactions to be the ones that get onto the blockchain first. And that's one of the features that will come out of this mechanism. We're also going to show that we're going to get non-manipulation results with many users. And that's really important because manipulation is a fundamental issue. And if we set something up to manipulate, it's not going to get us very far. We're going to show that it actually maximizes social welfare of all the participants. So this particular mechanism is actually going to have the features that we would really like to have: efficiency, social welfare, non-manipulation. And another thing that it's going to actually end up doing is it's going to reduce the volatility of miners' fees. And so for miners, the variability of those fees can make it difficult for them to plan. And so that will help. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk a little bit about related work, because we're obviously not the only people working on this. We'll talk about just two little papers here, not little papers, two papers to sort of look at different approaches. One paper by Lavi, Sata, and Zohar is in computer science. And they think about setting up a fee algorithm that would optimize miner revenue in a monopolistic miner setting. If I were a miner, I would really like theirs, but we're really focused on something very different. We are more interested in efficiency, right? And we also want to have many, many miners, not just one. So our work is very different from theirs, although theirs is, of course, a very interesting paper. Another paper is by Vitalik Buterin. Many of you know that name. He's one of the co-founders of Ethereum. It's not just Bitcoin that has this problem. Ethereum has exactly the same problem, as do most cryptocurrencies. So Buterin has a paper in which he sets the fees and block size vary all the time based on demand. But the challenge of that is you have to infer and estimate demand curves. And I think those of us in economics and finance are well aware of the challenges of doing that. So again, a very different approach, but we're all interested in kind of the same problem. How do we get there? So let me show you what our stable fees algorithm looks like. In a half-hour seminar, I do not have time to go through the model, which is probably for the best, because when you work with computer science guys, they're really good at graphics. So let me show you how this is going to work. So we have transactions out there. There's a little transaction. That little $sign is a fee that's attached. And there's a miner. And the miner is going to go out and he's going to gather up these transactions to put into a block. And here's a block. So he's gathered all these little transactions. Each of them has an appended fee that's there, or at least, it's what people say they'd be willing to pay. And you'll note at the bottom, I'm saying full star block. I'm going to make that clearer in a minute. In this algorithm, though, you actually aren't going to pay necessarily what you bid, because we're going to move to a second price framework. So every transaction in that block is actually going to pay the minimum fee paid by any transaction in that block. The miner is going to be paid the average fee of the block from the last B blocks. So it's a different approach, as opposed to, I'm going to pay this, I take it all as the miner, and we move on. So the main differences are obviously the minimum fee charged, the miner is paid over an average of blocks, and now we're going to talk about some of the details of this. One of them is this notion of a full block. So we're going to require that some % of the block is filled with transactions. Now, the block is usually defined by a size. It's really sort of a computer capacity argument, how big can fit into this block. We are not going to require that it have all transactions. There are two things that are going to happen here. One, It could be that it's kind of a lull in what's happening out there, and there actually aren't that many transactions waiting to be put on there. So we're going to allow the miner can declare that the mempool was too empty to get that many transactions. And so he'll put however many there are, and all users get charged the minimum fee that's included in the block. A second wrinkle is that the miner can also not fill the percentage above that. He can fill the amount above the 80%, say, and by using something called a fill penalty. And so the challenge that miners face is that they may want to include transactions for business purposes. It could be, for example, payments that are for others in their mining consortia. There could be other reasons going on. So we're going to allow the miner to have a part of the block that they can fill with transactions, and those transactions will not count in coming up with the minimum fee for the underlying block. The fee setting, as I mentioned, is set by the lowest transaction fee, the kth fee in the block. Now, I'm certain that we have some very accomplished auction researchers out there who are, at the moment, saying, but wait a minute, second price auctions work off of the K plus first transaction, not the kth, and that's certainly true in general. But here's our problem. We don't know what the K plus first transaction will be because you don't know what the miner didn't take. So as a result, this is going to open the door to potential manipulation. We're going to use the K transaction because we can see that if you think about there being K transactions in a block. And so one of the things we're going to be looking at is how important is this in terms of affecting the potential for manipulation. So let's talk about what do we mean by manipulation here. Well, one of them is that the miner can submit fake bids to increase his payout. So let's do a simple little thought experiment here. Suppose there are room on the block for 8 transactions, right? And 5 of them actually, when he looks out there, all have pretty high fees, and he grabs all of those. And then 3 of them have really kind of low fees, the next 3. And so if he puts those in, it's the bottom one that would set the fee for everybody. But our sneaky little miner could do the following. He could create fake bids that are equal to, say, the bottom of the top 5. Remember that the neat thing about the blockchain is that it's very hard to actually, take someone's coins, right? You can't impersonate someone, but you can create lots of accounts. And so the miner can create his own accounts, put in 3 fake bids. He'd have to pay the fees on the 3 fake bids, but he could still do it, and that could lop off those low ones and raise the fee. That would be a manipulation. A user can manipulate their own bids, right? So the user, instead of bidding what it's worth to them, which is what we'd like if the auction were efficient, they could bid any kind of things and manipulate it all over the place. Similarly, and this is one of the issues that you have to deal with, they could pay the miner on the side to circumvent the auction. One of the reasons we have this fill penalty and the ability for the miner to have some flexibility in transactions is we really don't want users paying things on the side and circumventing the auction, because then it just all deteriorates. We can show that our algorithm is robust to these in the limit, and we're going to demonstrate using various empirical techniques what happens before that. So here's the good news. Since I didn't show you the model, we don't have to go through the proofs either. So here we go. I'm just going to tell you what do we find when we do the empirical work. Result 1 basically says what? If you use the stable fees mechanism, truthful bidding is not a dominant strategy for users, but we can show that if all other users bid truthfully, the expected gain to any bidding from strategic bidding converges to 0 as the number of users grows large. So once we get large enough in terms of users, your incentive to start bidding untruthfully disappears. Result 2 is that if the stable fees mechanism is employed and users bid truthfully, then any miner's gain from optimal manipulation converges to 0 as the number of users grows large. So our miner's incentive to manipulate is also going to go away as long as the number of users is large. And the third one, which goes on, but basically says, here's the good news. In any equilibrium, that you converge to maximum welfare. So remember, this is a typical game theory auction framework, we can have lots of equilibria. But what we're showing is that in our model, in the equilibria, as the numbers grow large, the manipulation essentially goes away. And more importantly, in any of our equilibria, we converge to maximum welfare. So that's a good thing. So let me see in my remaining time if I can show you some empirical analyses to sort of tell you what's going on here and see if I can give you more insights into what's happening. So one thing we'll do is we can simulate our algorithm. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw users' bids from a power law with a mean of 10 cents and a median of 2 cents. So first thing we're going to have, users are going to draw values from a distribution. So the value of the transactions of the user is going to be drawn from a distribution. Then we're going to have users draw from another distribution a power law with a mean of 10 cents and a median of 2 cents to figure out what transaction fee they're going to attach. The particular distribution we're using here was based upon looking at actual transactions fees in the Bitcoin market and recognizing that it actually did look like a power law. And over sort of the several months that we looked at, which was kind of a quiet period, this looked like a sensible distribution. We're going to let our miners manipulate. They can drop transactions. They can do all kinds of interesting things, which would increase minimum transaction fees paid by users. In this particular one, we're going to assume equal power by miners, but we all know that mining consortia are important. So later in the paper, in the presentation, we'll actually look at what happens when miners have power. And then at the end of this, we're going to look at the miner gain from manipulation. So here's a picture. So up there, you've got number of miners, and you've got B. B is the blocks we average over. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side, right, on the vertical axis is the gain from manipulation. This is using the stable fees algorithm. The gain from manipulation is actually remarkably small. In our simulation, the miners' revenues were ranging from about $15 to $40, but the gain from manipulation using it never actually exceeded 3 cents. So even in its simplest form, before we get into large numbers of whatever, this thing seems to work quite well. But you can see that it actually can be made to work even better by changing both the number of buckets that we, auctions that we average over and the number of miners. So looking at the top, if you only use 2 buckets to average the fee, you can see that it doesn't matter too much about the number of miners. The amount of manipulation stays about the same. But as we increase the number of buckets, it drops off dramatically. So if we average over the last 10 auctions, you see that the manipulation falls dramatically. It becomes almost zero. And similarly, for all bucket sizes, as you increase the number of miners, the manipulation gain goes to zero rather rapidly. This is what happens, sort of flipping it around. Now we have the top part, the bottom part now, the horizontal axis, is the number of blocks we average over in our auctions, and then we look at it for various types of miners. And again, very similar results, but one of the things that becomes very clear here is that using as few as 10 blocks pretty much gets rid of this problem. So the mechanism we're setting up is fairly feasible. The miner is going to get paid not just on the block he formed. He gets paid an average of the fees over the last 10 blocks, including that block. That does a lot to take away the potential to manipulate. So for example, if our miner is putting in phony transactions, he actually pays those fees. And since he's getting paid the average over the blocks, he's not the one who just gets to put it back in his own pocket. And that's some of the features that we worked on to make this work. Now, we also thought it might be useful to say, well, you're only showing me how your mechanism does compared to your mechanism, which is fair. But it would be kind of fun to think about how does this outcome differ if we looked at comparing our mechanism to how, for example, fees have behaved in Bitcoin and Ethereum. So the challenge to get things on the block is particularly difficult when there's a high volume period. And certainly one way to look at that would be to look at the height of the last bull run, which was December 2017. So we're going to do a real simple analysis here. We're going to say, well, what would happen if instead of using the first price mechanism that was used in December 2017, stable fees had been implemented? How much could users have saved, and how predictable do miner payouts become? So let me stress that we can't go back and redo this with different strategies, and we're well aware that when you have a different mechanism, you might have different strategies. But it's still useful to think about, so what would it have done, recognizing that the strategy, cannot be changed since we're looking back historically. And it turns out it would have made a huge difference, right? This is the amount of overpayment in Bitcoin relative to what would have been paid if you had used the stable fee algorithm. And so you add it all up just in that 1 month, it was 274 million in transaction fees. And Ethereum looks kind of similar. It's lower for two reasons. One, Ethereum prices are lower, and also there are more blocks in Ethereum. So here you can see the total savings over that month was 13.2 million. So what about those miners? Up front I mentioned that one of the advantages for miners is that there's less volatility in the fees. And you can see here, the current mechanism, when you looked at what happened to the volatility of fees, is the blue dots. Stable fees is the red dots. So miners get more predictability. And as we saw, the stable fees were significantly lower in terms of fees. I want to turn in my remaining time to a couple of things, but mostly what I want to do is I want to think about alternative mechanisms. So let me be very clear that we're not claiming we have an optimal mechanism. That would be very difficult to show in the environment that this is in. But what we are claiming is that the stable fees mechanism appears to have better properties and better outcomes. And but as I mentioned up front, there are others who have also proposed different ways to do fees. So we thought it might be fun to kind of see if we could see how we'd compare with them. So what we're going to ask really about is how much efficiency gain does stable fees generate relative to others. So we're going to run simulations. We're going to let block sizes equal 2,000 transactions. We're going to have 20,000 users who could potentially, have transactions. The user's true value will be selected from a distribution. Users will bid, right, and what they're willing to attach to their transaction. And miners can manipulate if they want to. And we're going to create 1,000 blocks, and then we're going to look at what happens at the end of all of that. And we're going to look at two different variants of our stable fee algorithm. One is the one we've been talking about, where all the miners have essentially epsilon, hash power. So they're all more or less the same. And the second variant, which we'll call stable fees opt, allows for market power on miners. So we'll have a large miner who has 20% of hash power. We're going to compare that to 4 other possible ways to do things. One is we'll call it Ethereum, and Ethereum, I forget the name we call it, but we do something. Well, whatever it is, you'll see in a second. 2 versions of Vitalik Buterin's approach that involves estimating the demand curves and changing the block sizes. And we will also compare it with the monopoly approach of Avi et al. And we also have something called randomized optimal sampling, which I'm not going to talk about, but in computer science guys. So here's a welfare comparison. Let's be very clear what welfare means, all right? Welfare here means that our miners have, miners and users essentially all have quasi-linear utility in money. Right? So they have quasi-linear utility in money. And if you think about utility here for users, it's the value of the transactions of the user minus their fee, right? And for the miners, their welfare is the fee that they get from the users. And so when you want to think about welfare in this setting, you know, the fees that go from one person go to someone else, the miner. So they kind of cancel out. So really what you're looking at in terms of welfare is which system is going to actually allocate the right transactions onto the blockchain. That's how you're going to maximize the welfare here. And so you can see with the picture on the left, stable fees and stable fee opt are two columns on the right of that chart, and you know, we do pretty well. They seem to be pretty high. The Ethereum, which is the main one, the Vitalik it has come up with, is close in one of its versions and not in the other. The monopolistic one, not surprisingly, welfare doesn't do as well because the monopolist takes it all. So on a welfare perspective, stable fees seems to do quite well. If what you're particularly interested in is user fees, then you can see that stable fees does extremely well. Both stable fees ops and stable fees have dramatically lower fees than the other algorithms that we're comparing ourselves to. So I think that I'm just about out of time. So what do I want to conclude here? Well, what I hope we've done in this seminar is shown you an interesting problem. I think it's a really interesting problem. We really enjoyed working with our computer science colleagues on this. I think it's an important problem. And to me, it's an important thing to solve. If you're going to have cryptocurrency have any transactional role, the fee structures have to be better. And again, if you think about this from the way I always look at things, which is kind of a microstructure perspective, it's not surprising that you need to get the fine details right? That there are ways we can make these markets better. We know how to make them better. And in this particular case, we've shown how a variant of a second price auction can be robust to miner and user manipulation and can enhance social welfare. So with that, Alberto, I'll stop, and I guess we'll open it up a bit. And I want to encourage, I do have co-authors lurking around here. I seem to have lost the one I had sitting next to me. I don't know where he went. But I think
I think they're going to be unmuted now, so they're going to be able to answer the questions along with you. That's great. So I think we have a question. Peter's raised that, but before that, I actually want to ask a question myself. So one question I have is this. So we know that Lavi, Sada, and Zohar, they want to maximize revenues from the fees. And instead, you guys want to maximize social welfare. But in a world where there are many different cryptocurrencies, how do you convince miners to mine yours and not others if they can be, the other ones can be more profitable for them?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And it is one that actually a paper topic we've been thinking about as well. I mean, you know, there's an interesting challenge, right? That you need a certain number of miners. You need a certain number of miners for security. And without that, the blockchain can't work. And you're exactly right. If we forced our fees down too low, then the miners might say, to heck with this, right? And in an auction setting, there actually is a way that you can kind of get a minimum number of miners, and that would be to put in a minimum fee. And that's what it's in auction theory, it's a reserve price. Right, so if you got too few miners, then one way would be to put a reserve price, a minimum fee that could, you know, at least keep the number of miners that you need. You know, the miners' choices of where to go are interesting because they are indeed focused on their fees, but they're also focused on the value of the currency. And, you know, to the extent that Bitcoin still looks like the best deal in town, or Ethereum, provided we can keep the minimum fee to a point where we're viable, you know, it still may make a lot of sense given the potential appreciation of the currency to stick around. So yeah, I think that the idea of maximizing miner revenue is great. You're gonna have tons and tons of miners. But on the other hand, if you have tons and tons of miners, that's not what they're looking at. They only have a monopolist. And so I'm not entirely sure, you know, that that's the problem we want to solve.
I see. Perfect. So I know that Pete, for example, and Lydia were very active in the chat, but they also raised their hands. So I'm going to give the word to Pete right now. Pete, I'm unmuting you. You may speak.
Hey, can you hear me?
Hi, Pete.
Yeah, very well.
Hi, this is Peter Zimmerman from the Bank of England. My question is about whether your proposed mechanism affects incentives for miners. So the supply of blocks is elastic in the short term in that miners can be incentivized to contribute more hash rate and increase the supply of blocks if fees are higher. So when B is large, doesn't your proposed mechanism dent that incentive?
Well, let's be kind of clear, right? I mean, the number of blocks gets influenced in like in blockchain. And again, I'll give an answer. I'm going to turn it up to my computer science guys. Right, the number of blocks in a given day can vary essentially because every 2 weeks you change the difficulty, right? So if there are too few blocks, then you know the difficulty gets reduced. If there are too many blocks, it gets raised. So in general, you generally would expect to have approximately the same number of blocks because of the changes in the difficulties. So you know, I'm not entirely sure that's a problem that we were particularly concerned about, but I don't know, Sumya, Gun, David, did you want to answer something differently on that?
Yeah, I want to chime in and just mention something that. Hi. So, Peter, the issue with blockchain protocols is that they're self-pacing. So you do generally want a large miner community. You want them to be decentralized, etc. And the bigger the miners are, the more hash rate they have, then the more secure you are against attacks by other miners with the same equipment. So that's the exact specification of the security of a blockchain. It's very specific. So when you have more miners, you do not process the blockchain any faster. When you have Bitcoin miners rush in, only on the very short term do you produce blocks faster. The protocols are self-stabilizing. Bitcoin stabilizes itself every 2 weeks, as you know. So in general, this sort of you know, let's spike the fees to bring in more miners doesn't really well, at least in the you know, on any time scale beyond 2 weeks, doesn't bring you any faster processing ability. So it is not something that is essentially worth considering.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. And the next question comes from Lidegan. I'm unmuting you right now. You may speak.
Hi there, thanks for that. So I have actually two questions. The first one is that actually I don't understand how to be sure that miners agree to pay a fee penalty if they just, you know, there's a bear market, or does it cause an alternative fork in, you know, the short run?
Well, I mean, again, one of the questions is how would you implement this, right? And we talked a little bit about implementation in the paper, right? I mean, you would kind of have to get agreement that we were going to move to this. You know, so someone like in Ethereum could say, okay, from now on, Ethereum is going to look like this. But the implementation would have to be something that's agreed upon. Sumya or Gun, do you have any? I mean, I think that's fairly straightforward, isn't it?
Okay, yeah, no, that's understandable. So I have another second question then. So how do you construct a social welfare function? Like, what is the importance of miner over the users? Like, what are the key mechanism? Right.
So the key thing here is a very simple structure, right? And it's kind of standard. You'd find this in many settings, like cost benefit analysis or wherever. Everybody here's welfare is given the same value, and as I mentioned. Remember the fees that the users pay, which is the value to the user of a transaction on the blockchain is the value of the transaction minus the fee they have to pay in utility terms. And that fee in turn becomes the revenue for the miner, and they have quasi-linear utility and money. So the users and the miners more or less are on equal footing here, and what one gets, you know, how it's distributed between users and miners is kind of irrelevant when you look at welfare this way. Now, I think you're right. I suspect behind your question is the idea, well, might we not want to have different weightings, right? Might we not want to say, gee, miners come with externalities like all their electricity usage, and might we not want to adapt this mechanism in a way that actually kind of penalizes the miners? And you know, I think, speaking for David and I, and hopefully my co-authors as well, I think we can actually investigate alternative ways to do the welfare. But as was pointed out by our just previous question, you have to be a little careful here, because we need to keep, you know, we can't just say, okay, minimize miner revenue and make all the users better off, because then you don't want to have the miners mining. And without the miners mining, then nothing works. So I think there is, however, some interesting ways that we can develop this paper to think about alternative utility and welfare functions. But at the moment, we're using what's kind of a standard approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. I see still a hand from Pete. Pete, do you have another question? If you do, I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I don't. So I haven't lowered my hand. Apologies.
Okay. No problem. Okay, then I actually have a question. So the question I have is, how do you actually implement it? So can you kind of fork the current kind of cryptocurrency protocol and implement it in Ethereum, for example, or is it something that would need to start from scratch for a new cryptocurrency?
Let me turn this over to Gun or Sumya, because I think they know a lot more about how you go about doing this than I do. Gun, do you have any thoughts on this, or Sumya?
The simple way to do this is to just change the underlying protocol. So when we set out down this path, we thought, hey, everybody is doing the same thing. They're copying each other. And what they're doing is the simplest possible thing to do, what Satoshi did. And it's obviously giving rise to bad dynamics. And the estimation mechanisms are obviously not paying off. In fact, the very first fee estimators in Bitcoin were ratcheting, as Maureen mentioned early on. So the right thing to do is for a community that wants its currency to be used and used freely and easily, especially by in automated settings, like by smart contracts, for them to say, hey, we're doing this wrong. This is a much better way of doing it. Let's change. And Ethereum is going down this path. They are considering the one approach that Maureen outlined by Vitalik, which is very, it's similar in spirit, except there's no proof that it works well. There's no proof that it will accomplish any particular aim. It's just a dynamic way of doing things that's probably better than a first price auction. So, in short, the simple, elegant way to do it is to change the protocol. But that, of course, requires a coordinated effort, and it seems hard for certain communities to make any changes at all. The Bitcoin community, for example, is so incredibly resistant to change, and so in awe of the work that Satoshi did 10 years ago that they can't even contemplate, besmirching Satoshi's legacy by changing any aspect of the protocol he left behind. So there they are, stuck. I think, as I said, the right way to do it is that, can you retrofit this as a soft fork? It turns out that on top of Bitcoin, you can do pretty much anything in a soft fork. So it's possible to implement this in extension blocks. It's possible to do this in a manner where you preserve the regular old mechanics in the main blocks of Bitcoin, but have an additional block, or maybe make it really small, the original blocks, but have a sidecar or have an extension block that is subject to any additional different rules put in there by using the mechanism that was used for the SegWit change. And so there is this notion of anyone can claim. There's a special kind of a transaction. So you make it seem like it's a payment to anybody, but then what you do in that extension area is you enforce a different set of rules. And it's not just anybody who can take it. It's that, okay, you have a different set of rules enforced in that other portion of the block. And there you can do a second price auction.
Okay, perfect. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any more raised.
I have a question for Maureen.
Go ahead.
Maureen, in a lot of our other markets, it's a repeated game, and that leads to credibility and reputational costs. So why does that not work here?
Well, I think it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure how reputation and things work here. You don't get to pick your miner, right? Unless you do all these side payments. And, you know, that's not the way this is supposed to work. This is a decentralized market. So when you do your transaction, you don't know who, you know, whether a miner is going to come in and take your fee. The only way it works is you have to attract your miner with a transaction. And, you know, there are these large consortia that do have these kind of side payments amongst themselves. Those have emerged. But for this to be used by you and I to buy something, the way, from our perspective, this is pretty much an anonymous market in terms of clearing. I have no idea who the miner is who's going to take it. And, you know, it's a very, you know, very decentralized system out there. So I think that's why repeat transactions here aren't going to, you know, I can, you know, I think repeat transactions and reputation work when you can establish a one-on-one relationship between the user and the miner, and that can't happen, at least not in the structure that we currently have.
Perfect. Next, next question comes from Coase John. Coase, you are unmuted. You may speak.
Maureen, I have two very brief questions. That's regarding the miners. Are you assuming there is free entry by the miners? And number two, in general, in terms of the implementation, you know, I don't know whether you're going to have difficulty in, you know, controlling the miner incentives sufficiently to get this mechanism to work.
So in the first part, the question of free entry, yes, right? When we, in our model, for one thing, we're looking at what can be, you know, a large number of miners, and even in our simulations, when we're looking at miners, we allow each of them to have epsilon power, so you can have zillions of miners. So that's not the issue. The implementation issue, I think, is the one that Gunn was talking a little bit about before, that, you know, everybody realizes that this is a problem, right? This is not sort of us creating a problem that doesn't exist. This is a problem that everybody sees. And, you know, it's a little bit like when we have markets and someone says, you know what, I'm going to introduce a different, you know, pricing model. I'm going to do maker taker, or I'm doing taker maker, or whatever, right? You know, if that type of pricing model meets the needs better, then people will eventually go there. And I think that's the same thing that, you know, I would interpret Gunn as saying that it would be easy if you were using, like, looking at Ethereum and saying, okay, guys, you know, here's how Ethereum is changing it, and this is how it's going to be. But you can still get there if instead, you know, people decide that, you know, gee, this is a better way. And, you know, you can, you know, have forks, or as Gunn mentioned, you can have these extensions as a way to implement it. So I think, you know, in general, what the community, the crypto community is looking for is a way to make crypto work better. Because if they don't, it's going to sort of always be, you know, off to the side as sort of an alternative asset that sometimes is interesting and other times is not. If you actually want this to be a transactional currency, you're going to have to do a better job. And that's where we're at. And so, you know, I think it's interesting that we got questions from the Bank of England. I mean, there's a lot of interest in how do you make digital currencies work, right? More broadly. So this is just a tiny piece of what I think is actually a fairly large research agenda that people can pursue on how do we get to a world where we have cryptocurrencies that can function better. So.
Okay, well, I don't think there are any more questions. This is a perfect natural stopping time. So let me thank Maureen very much for the great presentation. And let me also thank the audience. There were so many logging in. I think we got to 250 at some point. And so I think that this is the enthusiasm is great to see. And it is so crucial for us to keep on working on research during this time. Finally, let me thank Anna Kormis and Rina Agarwal. And make sure to follow us on Twitter at GUFinPolicy. And we will not have a seminar next week. And then next seminar is going to be by Luigi Zingales. It's going to be on April 17, and the title is Kill Zone. Thank you very much for joining, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Alberto.